Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. There are 2 vendor forms that are critical to avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. Now, each will have its own podcast episode explaining why it's critical and what data to collect on the form and why. Now, the first form is the vendor setup form, but with a twist. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 295, 2 company-branded vendor forms you need to avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. The vendor setup form with a twist. So the vendor setup form is the first form that I recommend that you have as a company-branded form because I think it's critical to have a company-branded form and collect more information than you would collect if you only required an IRS form W-9 or the applicable W-8 series of forms, the applicable W-8 form, I should say. And I've already jumped into one of the 2 reasons why I think you need that form. And the first one, of course, is you can collect more information because if you think about it, the W-9, you're only collecting the legal name and DBA if they have one, and then you're collecting just one address. And then you're collecting the tax ID, but that's it. So with your own vendor setup form, you can collect as much information as you need. And the second reason is you can make that form as user-friendly as far as language as you like. And so a great example is many vendors have no idea what a disregarded entity is in line or the description of line 2 on the IRS W-9. And so they don't understand that that is the name that the invoices will come in if it is a different name than the legal name on line 1. And so when you add that field to your vendor setup form, you can say just that. You can say, the name that your invoices will come in, right? Or you can say DBA or some combination of the 2 so that the vendor understands what that needs to be. And another big one, by the way, and this is one of the big reasons why we used to have to send a lot of our W-9s back for those folks or vendors that were in that first tax classification, individual sole proprietor, used to be individual sole proprietor, single member LLC prior to the March 6, 2024 update. But anyway, many of those vendors did not know that they were supposed to put their first name and last name on the first line, not the name that their invoices would come in. And so specifically spell that out in the description or the name of the field where you're collecting that information. So you can say legal name as shown in your income tax return, which they probably won't know what that is, or maybe they will. Or you can say your first and last name if individual / sole proprietor, or business name. And that might make it clearer than what the IRS has put on the W-9. Now, I will say that the IRS did make it a little more clearer on their most recent revision of the W-9 with the March 2024 revision. They kind of say that, but they say it in a little longer words. And so you may want it to be even simpler and a briefer description. So that is, those are the two biggest benefits. Again, the fact that you get to collect more information and you get to really make it more user friendly as far as the wording, the verbiage. And by the way, you can also put it in different languages, and maybe not so much the W-9 for U.S. vendors, because most of them, they probably already speak English, and so that's not an issue. But it might be an issue for non-U.S. vendors where you're collecting the W-8, one of the W-8 forms. And so that might make it easier if you convert it to their local language, which you can do if you have a vendor setup form. Now, you might be wondering, why the heck are you continuing to talk about W-9s and W-8s if we're talking about a vendor setup form? Well, guess what? That is the twist. So the twist is you can combine a vendor setup form with the IRS's versions of the W-9 and the W-8. The IRS allows substitute W-9s and substitute W-9 and also substitute W-8 forms. And as a matter of fact, they allow you to combine all the forms into one. So if you already have a vendor setup form, you can combine the IRS's W-9 or W-8 with that vendor setup form. You just have to make sure that you include all of the requirements for those particular forms that the IRS requires you to have. And that includes things like the certifications, right? So you have to have those on there. Now, the requirements are found on the requesters for the forms W-9 and then the W-8s. And so you'll want to access those from the IRS's site. I will put a link to both of the instructions from the IRS in the show notes. So make sure you check those if you want them. All right. So that's the twist, is to include the W-9, W-8 forms with your vendor setup form, combine them into one. And that brings a whole new benefit, because now where you, especially for those who were already had a vendor setup form, and then you also required the IRS's form, so the vendor in effect had to give you two forms, then now if you combine them with into one, now you only have one form that the vendor has to give you. And by the way, if that vendor already has a W-9 form or the applicable W-8 form completed, they can attach it to your form. But if they don't, you don't have to worry about it, because guess what? You already have all the requirements of the IRS W-9 form or W-8 form in your vendor setup form. And that's another tip too that I want to talk about, because the IRS does call them substitute W-9 forms or substitute W-8 BIN or W-8 BIN-E forms, but you don't have to call it a substitute W-9 form or W-8 BIN or W-8 BIN-E form. you can just call it a vendor setup form. Now, what I typically do is I will have a vendor setup form for US vendors, and I'll have a vendor setup form for non-US vendors. And the non-US vendors will have all of the requirements for the W-8 bin and the W-8 bin-E, since those are the two forms that we tend to collect more often in accounts payable. And then on the form in the instructions, I will say if you want to submit a W-8 IMY, W-8 EXP, or W-8 ECI, then attach those forms, because those types of forms, the vendors that would submit those forms pretty much know that they need to submit them. They know how to complete the forms correctly because they are governments, businesses, agents. And so they've done that before, and they probably already have them available. And so the substitute W-8 form that I have is really for the substitute, or for the W-8 bin and W-8 bin-E, and then instructions are to attach the other W-8 forms if they apply to you. And so that also works with the fact, again, that you are calling this a vendor setup form versus a substitute W-8 form or a substitute W-9 form. And by the way, when you call it a substitute form for like a W-9 or W-8, if they have the forms already filled out, then they're going to push back on having to fill out a substitute one of those forms, even though they see that the substitute version of the form collects more information. They just, want to check that form off their list of the things that they want to give you and make it as quick as possible. And so they'll push back on it. So change the name and it will be much smoother. All right. So we've talked about the benefits. We've talked about the twist. And so now let's talk about what you should include on the form. And when I say include, I mean what I have included on the substitute version of the forms that I have created, but you can have other fields as well. Just take a listen to these and see if there are any additional ones that you would like to add, or maybe some of the ones that I've included you might not need to add to your particular company branded vendor setup form. And by the way, these fields were added, one, to comply with the IRS, and two, to also avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So let's talk about them. So starting with the substitute W-9 form, and this is for U.S. vendors, I am asking for a checkbox of whether they are submitting a social security number, an employer identification number, or an individual taxpayer identification number. Now, these are 3 of the 4 taxpayer identification numbers that the IRS accepts. The 4th one is an adoption taxpayer identification number that parents get for children that have been adopted, but the parents don't yet have their don't yet have their SSN and are not able to obtain it. And so they get a temporary A10 is what they call it. But once they get the social security number, then it goes away. And this is probably something that the children are not going to be a vendor of yours, but they are. If they are, you will want to add that A10 to the list of checkboxes for the type of tax ID that they're going to give you. And so I have the checkbox there so they can select which one they're giving me. And then it's a separate field that they can enter in, where they can enter in the tax ID. Now, the next one I have, of course, is the legal name and the DBA name. Now, I also have the Dun & Bradstreet number because that's something that a lot of my clients, and we used to do it too when I was a practitioner, we used to collect the Dun & Bradstreet number. That, by the way, was the number that was on sam.gov for vendors. So if you're a county or let's just say a government entity, you might want to collect the Dun & Bradstreet number, or maybe you did because at some point, or up until some point, I think it was last year, that was the unique identifier number on sam.gov. But now that unique identifier number is a separate, is not the Dun & Bradstreet number. It's a new one called the unique entity identifier, or UEI. So you might, if you are if you receive federal funding, we'll put it that way, then you might want to add the UEI, right, as a field on your vendor setup form to collect it. Now, what that will do, along with the taxpayer identification number and the legal name, is you can verify against multiple resources that the vendor is a valid vendor. And the UEI number can be validated against sam.gov to make sure they are a valid vendor, not to mention the fact there are watch lists that are that you need to check the legal name against, and some of them will allow you to input the tax ID or the UEI or the DUNS number so that you can further verify if there is a match using the vendor's name. Now, the next set of data that is collected by the vendor, of course, is the address, but I do have room for 2 addresses. So I have room for the legal address or remittance address, and you might want to call it, mailing address, whatever you normally give, but also verify or require that one of those is a physical address. So and this is really great for the W-9 because the W-9 only collects one address. And if that's a P.O. box or the street address of a P.O. box, you want to make sure that you're collecting a physical address, which you're not able to do using the W-9. Now, the next one, which you definitely can't collect on the W-9 or the W-8, is the contact name that you need to deal with, because a lot of times we don't get the contact name in the vendor setup and maintenance space. We get we don't get the contact name of who can, for example, validate bank account changes. We get maybe the salesperson or someone else. And so this way you can collect the contact name, but not only that, their phone number. I do have fax number on there, and then also email address. And then, of course, you have to have entity type the same way that it is on the W-9 and W-8 for that matter. And then on the W-9, of course, there is a new checkbox for those vendors that are a partnership, trust, or estate. And if your company is a partnership, trust, or estate, then if the vendor has an ownership interest and has non-U.S. beneficiaries or owners, right, they have to check that box. So that has to be on there too. The other thing, 2 things I have on it, or the next 2 things I have on it, are very customizable. I have the entity classification. And the reason that I have this is because, let's say a vendor selects, they will select the entity type of corporation, S corporation, C corporation. That is typically not, for that tax class, not reportable. However, if there are payments made that are reportable, even if they are a corporation, then you need to know that. And so that entity classification includes those types of payments, like legal attorney services, medical services, right? If you're paying for those are reportable, even if they're a corporation. I also have other government, and then field that they can type in and specify. The next one also can be customized for your industry. I have diversity classification, and so I just have 4, but technically there are 17, and probably more than that, but 17 are that are widely recognized. But again, I only have 4. I have minority owned, small business, veteran owned, women owned, because that's usually the ones that my clients are interested in. And so I have those, but you can definitely customize the list. And then the next piece I think is great to avoid fraud, especially if there are any red flags, and especially if you are dealing with non-PO vendors, because you don't have a buyer that is, that's dealing with the vendor. So you need the internal team member that they have a relationship with. And so I asked the vendor, right, by adding these fields to input that information. And so that would be the department name, contact email address, and then contact phone number. Now, this also serves as a deterrent for would-be fraudsters, because even if they can get a name off the LinkedIn, then they have to think that you might contact them. So hopefully what will happen is the fraudster will just abandon this request and go on to the next potential victim that is not asking for these types of that type of information. And then I have room on here for a signature. Keep in mind that it is a digital signature, and there are times where a handwritten signature is required. And then next is page 2. Now, page 2, you might think substitute W-9 form, substitute W-8 form, right? Why do we need a page 2? Well, page 2 is where what I call modification to existing vendor records, and I am asking for authenticating data. So if you want to change the address, I need the existing address that's on file. And this might be easy for fraudsters to get, but again, I've preloaded, right, lots of data or fields on this form. So hopefully by the time they get here, they've already abandoned the request because it's just too much, and they can go to another potential victim that's not asking for this information. And so if they want to change an address, they have to give the existing address. If they want to change contact information, they have to give the existing contact information. And that is just to prevent fraudsters from changing the contact information to their own, so that when changes are made, they can submit a subsequent change to this one, and then they are the ones that are going to be contacted. Now, a lot of my clients will turn this off as far as being required, because they may not know who the previous contact is, but I would argue that they do know. But it could be said that they don't know which one is on your vendor record. So some turn it off, but I would require it, and then on a case-by-case basis, accepted without the prior contact information being completed. And then I also have tax ID. So if they're changing the tax ID, the legal name, the DBA, then they need to provide the prior number or the prior information, and they should have that. So that is what I include on the substitute W-9, substitute W-8 form as applicable. There are a couple additional fields that I require on the substitute W-8 form. It is the foreign TIN, and then since they can have, right, a foreign tax ID from a country that's other than the U.S., they do have them out there. And so I allow that. And then I allow have a field or fields for additional, those additional, tax IDs that they may have that are common, like VAT or GST, that you might collect if you have a lot of international vendors. And then I also have on there all of the certifications, right? There's a lot for non-US. There's also, I didn't mention it, but I also have the certifications for the W-9 as well. And the last thing that I have on the W-8, substitute W-8 form, is the date of birth, because the date of birth can be required by the IRS for non-US individuals under certain circumstances. So I have that on there as well. Now, if you would like to take a look at the forms, the substitute W-9 and substitute W-8 forms that I have, I will add a link to my vendor toolkit. It's something that is on the Vendor Process Training Center, and it is available to Vendor Process Training Pass members at no additional cost. It's also sold as a part of the vendor toolkit, but I do have the visuals of them like in plain sight. So you can take a look at those and, just use them as a guide to update your vendor setup form or to create one. And it will give you can blow them up. You don't have to purchase anything. And so I will put a link to the AVM vendor toolkit, and you can take a look at them at your convenience. And don't forget to customize the form. When I say company branded, I mean put your logo on there. Make sure you put your contact information of where you want the vendor to return the form to. Also, one thing you might not think about is put a version number on the form, because you actually want to update it on an annual basis. That will prevent team members from saving those forms and giving them to your vendors for the next, decade. Because if you update the form, you always want the vendors to have the most updated form. So you want it to come from you. And also, it's part of the authentication process where you, before you give those forms out, you verify that it is the vendor that you're giving it to, or it is the internal team member that you're giving it to. So if you authenticate them first, you then give them the form to fill out. And then if you receive, let's say, a form that is an old version, you will know that you just did not authenticate that vendor, and that can be or internal team member, because if you did, they will have the most recent version of the form. And so it could be a red flag. And if you're thinking, what the heck is authentication? I'm going to put a link to the 3-step vendor setup and maintenance process, authentication, validation, management. And there is a free training on authentication in that 4-hour workshop, but the free training is the first section. It is no cost, and it also comes with a template. Again, I'll put a link to that workshop in the show notes. All right, so that is the end of the episode today. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 295th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.